everybody. I am here with Mark Pracht, who is a playwright I met at Comic-Con this past summer, and you are finishing up, I guess, what I consider an incredible project, and in some ways go, how has it taken somebody this long to figure out to do it, but you are the playwright, sometime director of three plays called the Four Color Trilogy. That's the full thing.
Right.
The last one is opening next week, as we're recording this. So August 23rd, it goes into previews, called The House of Ideas. You are spanning the history of comics, creativity, and I think to some extent censorship, obviously, when you get to the second one. So before I go into this, we met the night of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund party at Comic-Con, and you were that day at a panel for them, which I missed because I didn't meet you until the night after. It was called Comic Bans, Learning from the 1950s Comic Book Scare. So what have we learned? I'm going to start with the deep question. What have we learned from the comic book scare?
Oh, well, that is a deep question. I think that, it's funny. Somebody asked a very similar question at the panel, and I almost feel like that's kind of beyond my pay grade. I feel like what we've really learned, though, is not a whole lot. I mean, we kind of, as with these things, with all of these kind of social things, it kind of shifts one way and then it shifts another. And as Jeff Trexler, who is the interim head of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, will tell you, this sort of stuff is not going away. Of course, it shifts from, sex and violence in the 50s or, to, LGBTQ issues now are the big thing. What I hope we've learned is that everyone who tries to regulate or control the content always has some sort of agenda that is really about not wanting people to see content that they don't find appropriate. And that is, I think, that's sort of part of the human condition. Everybody's like, I don't want to see it, so nobody should see it. And really, for myself, I'm like, just turn it off,
Well, yeah,
but don't read it.
You're a double whammy, as a comics fan, and you're a theater person. And I think, we face that, and people who follow me know I've been sometimes theater. And, so it's kind of interesting. I think we are back into that. You're right. It's the LGBTQ. But let's go lighter for just a second. What was the first comic you remember buying and loving? And which one made you a fan for life? Because it might not be the same one.
No, you know what? I think it was the same one. I used to have the number. It was Brave and Bold. I think it's in the 140s somewhere. It was Batman and the Unknown Soldier. It's the first thing that I remember reading by myself as a kid. And I just sort of fell in love with it. I fell in love with Batman, and to some extent fell in love with the Unknown Soldier. It was that Bob Haney 70s Brave and Bold run where
I love that.
Yeah. I mean,
I love those books more than anything else. Brave and the Bold was the one that made me a real fan.
Well, exactly. I mean, you could get that wide range of characters really easily. And the thing about Bob Haney was, of course, that his sort of disdain for canon made it like he'd just do whatever. And then you go into the other books and start to learn, like, oh, this is what the rules are. What do they call it? The Haney-verse?
I call it the Haney-verse. I don't know if I picked it up from somebody else, but definitely his versions of Plastic Man and Metamorpho and even Batman we're so different than anyone else,
Yeah.
so I did
But
love those books.
that's the
Yeah.
book I remembered. It was very funny when we did the first play in the trilogy, which was called The Mark of Kane and was about Bob Kane and Bill Finger. We actually got a panel at C2E2 in Chicago. And that day we were getting ready to do the panel, and one of the guys in the show with me was like, you should find that book. And we found it in like a dollar bin at one of the dealers there. So I had it for the panel, and I was like waving it around. I'm like, this is what caused all of this. So
Yeah. No, that's great. But again, that was the fun. That's where we discovered the love. And yes, the first of the trilogy is The Mark of Kane, which is when you grow up and you learn what was going on behind the scenes for these people. And I don't know that it's a whole lot better, but let's pretend it is now. But that it's very different. So for people that don't know your work, and I should have said up front, you are in Chicago. This is Chicago theater, which also carries a certain frisson, if you will. What was the spark that made you embark on writing this trilogy? You've been a playwright, been an actor for a while.
Yeah. My main thing is I've been an actor for many years, and I've dabbled in playwriting. And this is like, one of my first major projects. But it was about 10-15 years ago. I was thinking about doing something about the 50s and the comics code and the comic book scare and things like that. That was sort of like dancing in the back of my head. But then it was 2006. I was at San Diego Comic-Con, and I walked into a Golden Age Batman panel, and it was it's Jerry Robinson and Shelley Moldoff and Arnold Drake was on that panel, and a couple other guys. And it very quickly became the Bob Kane was kind of an a-hole panel. And I don't know if I could swear or not, but I mean, like,
sure, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it got there really quickly, and I was sort of taken aback. I mean, I sort of had known about Bill Finger, but I didn't, that the way that everyone talked about Bob Kane was sort of shocking to me. I didn't really, and then so I came back. I was flying back with a really good friend of mine, but the name is Sean Harkleroad, who's actually been in all three of these shows. And we were on the plane, and I was like, there's a play in this. And I got back, and I kind of put it in the file. And then it was the COVID shutdown, which stopped theater pretty much entirely. And I didn't have anything to do. So I'm kind of one of those people who, if I don't have something going as far as a creative outlet, I start to go crazy. So I was like, this is my chance to work on this. So I started working on it, and just had a lot of opportunity, a lot of friends who didn't have anything to do. So we were doing a lot of like Zoom readings of it and things like that.
Oh, great.
But and that's how it really developed and workshopped mostly. But yeah, it was that panel. I was sort of taken aback, and all of these incredible stories about, that maybe your listeners know about or not, with Bob Kane and his clown paintings. And that story was just like sort of shocking.
Yeah, I think for anybody, but I will mention throughout this, your plays, at least the first two, are available on Amazon, wherever, or from the publisher, from your website. And that panel is the framing of the play of The Mark of Kane. And I again, I know I said this in an email, but kudos to you, because you captured my memory of every one of their personalities. I'd seen Jerry Robinson, Arnold Drake. I remember Steranko's still with us, I think, thank God, but I mean, that is so Steranko. That is like all my image. So it is fascinating. And that is, you started thinking about the 50s, but you went back to this, and I think there's something, there's reference to Siegel and Schuster, but it really is the Bob Kane Batman story that, I don't know, I don't want to color it in any way, no pun intended,
Yeah.
but that kind of starts all this, and I see the connection.
Well, I mean, I think that like a lot of people have asked me about doing the Siegel and Schuster story, and I think that for me, the Bob Kane Bill Finger story is just much more dramatic and interesting because Siegel and Schuster, it's David versus Goliath, right?
Mhm.
And Bob Kane and Bill Finger, it's like one artist screwing over another artist. It feels much more personal. I think, I mean, I would assume that at this point, most people who listen to your podcast will know the Bob Kane and Bill Finger story, but it was so shocking to me to think about um, how Bob Kane just steamrolled this man and
Mhm.
and left him in the wreckage, truly. And in the play, I have Steranko, and it's a line that I heard Steranko say, not in person, but on a video. It's like, not one person, not one person in comics has a good Bob Kane story. And I was just sort of, I was, at that point.
I can counter Steranko, but it's to a point, a question I want to ask you in a moment. There is
Sure.
one person who did, um, Stan Lee. So I'm going to ask, thematically, when you've got this Bob Kane, and I also I grew up thinking this was an EC story, but I think it may have actually been an Eerie or Creepy. There's a panel that was in a book when I was 1970, read this, had no idea who it was about. You know what I'm talking about.
I
I'll
know
get to
exactly
it
what
when I
it's in
finish
Creepy.
ruling these panel borders. And I
Yeah.
think about that story at least weekly when
Yeah.
I encounter anybody trying to take credit for anybody else's creativity.
Right.
And
Well, yeah. It's how do I put this? I think we can say a lot of things about Stan Lee. We can say a lot of things about Stan Lee.
yeah,
But the one thing about Stan that I will say is that he never Jack Kirby's name is in all those books,
yeah,
right?
give him that.
Steve Ditko's name is in all those books. Now, whether Stan or Jack and Steve got the credit after the fact that they should have, which is a totally valid conversation to have. It wasn't like what happened with Bob Kane, where Bill just was gone, you
Yeah.
know, and that, uh, and Jack and Steve didn't die penniless alone in an apartment building in 1974,
So
that
tragic.
it's 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 really unconscionable, really. I mean, and everybody points to his autobiography that, of course, was ghostwritten by somebody else. And there's one paragraph that mentions Bill and says, I should have given more credit, that his ghostwriter basically has said, I kind of forced Bob to put that in there. And
I believe that. Yeah.
yeah, and it's it
Yeah.
yeah
Sadly, when you talk about comics, these things that have given us so much love, there's so much tragedy, and I will
Yeah,
point anybody watching or listening to, I think it's still on Hulu, the Batman and Bill
absolutely.
documentary, which I cried for his granddaughter at the end,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's just an amazingly powerful piece. Now, your
Yeah.
audience, I
Mhm.
assume, I mean, I think theater goers, there may be this weird Venn diagram of theater goers and comic book readers, but
Mhm.
I don't know how much that crossover is. But so I'll go with them as being the average person. They know who Stan Lee is, they know who Jack Kirby is. Again, your latest one being the House of Ideas. And they probably know Bob Kane because, man, that guy did a pretty good job of selling himself.
Absolutely.
And you fictionalize and create a lot of composites. You still have a lot of really deep cuts in terms of people, real people.
Yeah.
Has that caused, do you know any feedback from audiences wondering, like, because I want to call out in The Innocence of Seduction, focusing on Matt Baker and I terrible at her name, Louise,
Janice Valou. Yeah.
Janice Valou. There we
Mhm.
go. Who I'd read
And
about in All in Color for a Dime or the 10 Cent Plague,
the
and
10 Cent Plague. Yeah.
yeah, those are people that nobody knows who they are. Matt Baker's getting kind of a renaissance right now, but
Yeah.
again, you got to really be a fan to know who he was.
Mhm.
So, are there people coming back to you saying, wow, they want to know more? Do you have like a the more you know at the end of these plays?
Uh,
Where did you research?
well, I mean, like, I since you've purchased the plays, and thank you for that. You do know, like, the introductions of each one. I always say that this is a fictionalization. I'm not trying to create a documentary here, and that if you want to know more, there's plenty of places you can go and read more about these people. Uh, Janice Valou is not so much. I mean, really, the only place I can find any real information on Janice Valou is in the 10 Cent Plague. And I do want to call out that book by David Haju, I believe. It
Hmm.
is I think, the definitive book about that period, and it introduced me to a lot of things. Uh, the one thing that I found really interesting as I delved more into it is that book doesn't really touch on Matt Baker's apparent homosexuality. Um, but what immediately struck me once I found that out was you had this amazing story in that play where you have these people who are affected by this crackdown and then the comics code, and the person in that of Bill Gaines who had the most power to try to stand up against it was not the most effective person to do it, and the people who had no power were the ones who suffered the most, right? Matt
Hmm.
Baker kind of fell out of the industry. He did a little work for Stan Lee in the late 50s, but the last things he wrote or he drew were like a bowling handbook. And Janice was so terrified, at least this is what I've read. Janice
Yeah,
was so terrified by what happened that she left the business entirely. And like, Bill Gaines, who we can all admire, and I do admire Bill Gaines, but I mean, like,
yeah,
he had the wherewithal to be able to work his way out of it, the Mad Magazine thing, uh,
yeah.
you know, uh, but then these people who, were the most
Yeah, no, I
vulnerable.
mean, this is
Yeah.
one of the few interviews where I feel like I'm going to have to run a bibliography with all this because you could no, and I knew when we talked before at that party that it's like, oh, I've met somebody who has read the same things I have, because I can say,
Hmm.
if you want to know about Matt Baker, read the excellent Ken Quattro book from a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
Invisible Men,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is where I found out about it. I mean, here's this guy whose art I've loved unknowingly
Yeah.
most of my life, and
Yeah.
loving those incredible artists of the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, and there's a Tomorrow's book, The Art of Glamour, that's all about Matt Baker. That is magnificent. Yeah.
Okay, so I get to put that in there too.
Yeah.
You know, but you bring up, you know, Bill Gaines. There's the interesting thing. Bob Kane, a fantastic spokesperson for himself, who
Mhm.
didn't want to be part of the industry at all. The clown paintings thing, I just like, I know that was true. You know, and I saw some stills from your from the production of the Mark of Kane. I'm like, you can spot Bob Kane, you know, even if
Yeah.
he doesn't look that much like him, sort of does, but you know, it's like, oh, that is my memory of him. Uh,
Yeah.
and Stan was, I don't know if this is where you land with the House of Ideas, but you know, Jack was a magnificent creative powerhouse. Stan was an incredible pitchman. He was the salesman, and
Yeah.
Bill Gaines was not. Bill
Yeah.
Gaines was that sweaty, drug addicted guy who, you know, he looked terrible on television, right? On a
Yeah. Yeah.
televised hearing.
I mean, it was really interesting. There was one of the most interesting things about the critical response to the two shows was there were a couple of, like, the Mark of Kane got fantastic reviews. I couldn't even have asked for better reaction to it. Like, we got a lot of attention, a lot of press, a lot people just loved it. And but there were a couple of reviews of the Innocence of Seduction where the simple the simple act of putting Bill Gaines central in the story, there were people who were turned off by that. Uh, you
It's
know,
interesting.
and you know, and there's, these are plays for a general audience.
Yeah.
When we were workshopping the scripts, like every time we'd finish a reading, the first question I'd have is like, is it too inside baseball? Is there too much here that is for comic fans? And am I, the whole idea that I have with all of these is to try to present information in a way that contextually explains it to an audience who's watching the show, where they can be like, I don't quite know who that is, but I understand what they do and what their context is. Uh, so, uh, but they don't have the framework that we have about Bill Gaines as somebody
Mm-hmm.
who did his best, the best he could to try to head off this thing. Um, and I think that the one of the first scenes I have with Bill Gaines is him. Al Feldstein comes into the office with his, headlight girls drawings, and Bill Gaines, the story that I loved, where he takes off his glasses and basically puts his nose all the way down on the art, and he's like, "Do you use live models?" And I think that there are certain people who got just turned off by that, and I think that that comes back to what I was talking about how our, human nature is to be like, I'm offended by this. I don't see why anyone else should want to see it. And it's like, Bill Gaines was a difficult person, I think.
I think
I
even as
mean,
a kid, when I was reading Mad Magazine and they would show him, and you know, in the usual gang of idiots,
yeah,
I knew he was not supposed to be this guy that I was thinking was, ooh, he's cool, you
yeah,
know, and so I
yeah,
and I gotta give you credit too, just from the theatrical perspective, is I love how you structured the two plays that I've read. You know,
hmm,
unfortunately, I'm going to be honest to anybody here. I'm not going to have a chance to see this production of the House of Ideas, but I can't wait for the opportunity to buy the script because I love the way you phrase it. You know, the Innocence of Seduction with Wertheimer as the crypt keeper.
yeah,
Essentially, you know, you find the things that people know they
yeah,
might not know about. Well, not Wertheimer, Wertham, Frederick Wertham,
with him,
that they
yeah,
may not. The average person might not know about the seduction of the innocent, but they know who the crypt keeper is.
yeah,
You know, which is kind of
yeah,
interesting that out of this, all that's what he got. But
yeah,
the House of Ideas, I said, is you know, Stan and Jack, and I do have to wonder. You know, I know we're running longer than I usually like to, but I can't stop talking to you about this stuff.
Mhm.
Uh,
I'm happy to
with
talk as long as you want.
okay, well, the trilogy. You know, you established this as going to be a trilogy, and so I thought if somebody came back to you and said, you got to add another one, or do you have another? Because I think you've hit 3 very seminal moments, and what would you add?
I will tell you right now, I have a idea for a fourth part of what would then become, I would call, the four color cycle. And it's something that I don't really want to talk about yet because
Then
it
don't.
is, well, I mean, but I can tell you it is a story that I think I have spoken to people who were directly involved with it, and they've actually been fairly encouraging to me. But it is the first time that it would deal with people who are actually still with us.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to make some headway into being able to actually speak to some of those people, because I would want to do that before I jumped into it.
I don't know. That makes
So,
sense. Which I'm going to
but
get. Yeah, good.
like to as a little teaser, uh, if the Mark of Kane was the 30s and the 40s, and the Innocent Seduction is the 50s, and the House of Ideas would be the 60s. It also goes past that, but I mean mainly the 60s. Then the one that I'm starting to formulate right now is the 70s, and one of the most important figures, I think, of the 70s.
Okay. I think, we'll get deep again, because I think when in reading particularly the Mark of Cain, and now you mentioned the 70s, there are two things going on right now that I think echo, which prove that sadly, we need your play, not sadly, because they're great plays, but we need them more than ever, and we need more people to be aware. I think that we've had this issue now with, and if I'm stepping on what your 70s idea is, Roy Thomas waiting so long to take credit
Yeah.
for the creation of Wolverine. And Len was a friend of mine, and it breaks my heart every time. And I don't know Roy, but I know Len's widow, and I feel like this is horrible. But I also think Colin Kaepernick and AI. This is where in the past month,
Yeah.
every week I've thought of, I'll get to this when I'm busy, when I finish ruling these panel prompts for my comics, that we are facing exactly what was going on in the 30s and 40s in
Yeah.
terms of comics, but now the stakes, or people think the stakes, are super high.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, like the one thing you could say somewhat in defense of what Bob Kane did was nobody knew. Nobody
Oh, no,
knew. I
that
mean,
is
yeah,
true.
like,
That is true.
yeah, like when Siegel and Schuster sold Superman, nobody knew that 80, 90, 100 years later people would still be wanting to read those stories, or uh but now we do know. And I don't want to, the Roy Thomas thing, I don't know. I mean, like, in the same way that, like, when you really drill down into the Bob Kane thing, it could be, it is altogether possible that what we know of Batman, as far as what came from Bob Kane, is a name, you
Yeah.
know. And does that mean that he should still have credit? I don't know. But I mean, I'm not saying that as a defense of what Roy Thomas is trying to do, which I feel is, like you say, it's very late in the game for you to start making that argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
But certainly the Colin Kaepernick thing, like, if you're going to spend all that money, why not spend it on people who actually can do this work? You know?
Why not start a
Uh,
comic book company?
yeah,
You know,
like it's
Kaepernick
it
books.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, I totally understand what he's saying about gatekeeping and things like that, as far as, like, you know,
Yeah.
artists of color and all of those things, because those are problems that we still have to grapple with,
Yeah.
as a society. But it's also like, that doesn't mean that you should be able to, plug a bunch of prompts into a computer and get some sort of image that's, ripped off from a dozen other artists that have been fed into this computer. Yeah. That whole thing bugs me. AI bugs me. Yeah, I don't even really think there's much more to say about it, but it is one of those things where we now know that these properties can be extremely valuable, uh,
Well,
and
I think it's interesting thematically, at least
yeah,
with Bob Kane and Stan. You just mentioned nobody knew.
yeah,
Uh, they wanted out of comics as quickly as they could. And that's
sure,
even before you get to the 50s, which, but
yeah,
Bill Gaines, you make a point of. He wanted to be a high school teacher. And when
yeah,
you read I can't remember the one of the Marvel history books where I mean, I know Marv Wolfman as well, and these are people that I know as older people. But when you go back to the 70s, they want out. Everybody thinks comics are about to die in
yeah,
every era.
mhm,
And then they're still here,
yeah.
and you're
Well, I
bringing them to
mean,
life through the theater.
look, yeah, it's comics are such a uh, were such a demonized art form for so long. Even in the 30s and 40s when they were so incredibly popular that it's hard to fathom, like millions of issues being sold. Uh, it was still just junk. I mean, I junk in terms of how people looked at it. I don't
Yeah,
think it's junk, but you know what I mean.
yeah.
Um, uh, Junk culture, shall we say? But and no one knew. I was reading. The name of the actual artist escapes me, but uh, it was one of the golden age artists, and somebody asked him about, like, well, did you ever want your art back? And he was like, why would I want it? You know, and it's like it wasn't until like fandom began in the 70s that ancillary stuff had any value, or in the not even I shouldn't say in the 70s, but I mean, like, I think that when San Diego started in 71 or 70,
Yeah, yeah.
that's when there was a sort of like organized fandom that was happening. And there was these people who, there were fans who wanted to buy original art and wanted, you know, pieces of history and things like that. And I think that it was just really hard to like, I think the industry was so slow to adapt to that sort of change. And I think that is partially, it is definitely, I mean, it's wrong. Let me start by saying that, but it's also like, it's really hard to break tradition. It's like, we've always done it this way. We've always done it this way. We've always done it this way.
Well, yeah,
And
I think in pop
yeah,
culture in general, all the media have been slow to that. I mean,
yeah,
we notice
absolutely.
that I have 7 Disney cells hanging in my hallway right now that I
Mhm.
got that were rescued from a trash bin
Yep.
in at the studios in 1971, by
Yep.
a friend who worked there, and he said, "You can have
Yep.
these," when I was a little kid.
Yep.
So I think we can wrap with hope for the future. And the House of Ideas, you're at City Lit Theater Company in
Correct.
theater in Chicago.
Mhm.
Previews from August 23rd to August 31st, and you're officially opening on September 1st, running to October 6th. And you can get
Yep.
tickets at citylit.org.
Yep.
Mark, I could talk to you for hours, and maybe next year at the CBLDF party we'll talk again.
That would be
But
lovely.
I'd love to see whatever is happening and hear more. So thank you so much for taking time tonight, because I know you've got
Thank
another
you.
tech run tomorrow. All right.
Yep. Thank you for having me, Derek. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Please hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss out on any Fanboy Planet video content. And visit fanboyplanet.com for other features, reviews, interviews, previews, and of course, listening to the Fanboy Planet podcast. And remember, use your powers for good.